All right. Well, I see it is 12:01 for me, and welcome everyone. I will get us started and hopefully more folks join us as they're able. Welcome to our speaker series for spring 2023. My name is Tatiana Shippey, and I am an Associate Director for Research at our Center for Healthy Aging and Innovation, or CHAI. CHAI envisions a community, state, tribal nation, country, and world where every individual can achieve their life goals while aging. We do this through core work in education, research, clinical practice, and equity and community engagement. Each year, we select topics that are of high interest to our members and community partners. And this year, we are focusing on ageism. Ageism is widespread, and many polls suggest that a significant portion of the population has experienced or witnessed ageism in different settings. And I see some of you responding in chat with your own experiences, and you see the question that we have there to share if you have witnessed ageism in the workplace, social situations, or other areas of your life. Ageism affects different people differently, including women, communities of color, and those with disabilities who may experience multiple forms of discrimination based on both age and other factors. Now, my own research shows that women experience age discrimination at work at higher rates prior to age 30 and then after age 55, with negative outcomes for their mental health and life satisfaction. We need action and solutions to address this persistent inequity. Hence, we're so pleased to introduce our speakers for this event. Our main speaker is Dr. Tracy Gendron, who will present her work for about 25 minutes. Her presentation will be followed by a discussion by an esteemed panel of national and local experts who are making a difference daily in their communities to address ageism. So without further ado, let me introduce Dr. Gendron. Dr. Tracy Gendron serves as chair for the Virginia Commonwealth University Department of Gerontology, as director for the Virginia Center on Aging, and is the author of the book Ageism Unmasked: Exploring Age Bias and How to End It. With over 25 years of experience as a grant-funded researcher and nationally recognized speaker, Tracy is dedicated to raising awareness and ending ageism through education. Tracy, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. It is a delight to be here with all of you to spend some time talking about a topic that is very important in general and very important to me. So I'm delighted to have this opportunity to do that. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. Okay, hopefully that's good and you can see it. If not, please let me know.
Looks great, Tracy.
Terrific. Okay, so again, my name is Tracy Gendron, and I'm here in Richmond, Virginia. And I have been thinking about, talking about, and researching ageism for probably about 10 years now, which started really with kind of one of my own moments of recognizing that I myself, even though I am a trained gerontologist, had a lot of internalized ageism, a lot of ageist thoughts, a lot of ageist feelings, and a lot of ageist behaviors. And that was kind of the prompt for me to want to understand it a little bit better so that I can challenge my own thoughts and behaviors and then translate that so that I could help others do the same. So I'm just going to share some of what I have learned and some of what I think about with you all today. So I think when I talk about ageism, what I really like to start with is talking about aging as a whole, because I think it's the way that we often misperceive aging that leads us right into ageism. So we use the term aging very broadly, but we also misuse it in very broad ways. Aging is often described as something that happens to other people. So for example, when we talk about what we do as a gerontologist, or what we do when we are serving older adults, what we will often say is that we are serving the aging population. I'm sure you've all heard this. Maybe some of you have done this. I have done it myself. In fact, this was kind of my first aha moment that I was othering, that I was using this term aging as if it was something that wasn't happening to me. So when we use aging to refer to a population that is not about all of us, it's kind of the first way that we begin to otherize, that we begin to talk about aging as if it isn't something that is a universal, something that isn't something that we're experiencing at all points in our life, every moment of our life. So using aging as other is one way that misunderstanding aging leads us right into ageism. Another way of misusing the term aging is that we very often refer to aging solely as a process of decline. So we talk very readily about how our bodies change over time and the losses that we have. And while that is a part of aging, that is certainly not all of aging. So when we talk about aging as something that we should be against, anti-aging, something that is all about things that we are losing or have lost, that's another way that it leads us right into pervasive ageism and a misunderstanding of the broad and beautiful and complex nature of aging. So what is aging then? Well, the complete story of aging means that we look at all of the different components and the ways that we continue to grow and change over time. Aging is within our bodies. It's also within our psyche and our emotions. It's also within our spiritual sense and how we connect to maybe a higher power. It's in our social roles and how we connect with other people and what opportunities that we may have. So aging is the holistic, multi-directional, multi-dimensional biopsychosocial spiritual process of change over time. Now, I say change because that change may include loss and decline, but it also includes growth. It also includes maintenance, and it also includes adaptation. So it's complex, and there is beauty in the complexity of it. So not being able to see the whole story of aging, the complete story of aging, is one of those ways that we often have tunnel vision and that we don't acknowledge all of the growth and development that we are experiencing throughout our lifetime. Often when people will say, well, I'm aging, so my body has changed in some negative way, I will redirect them and say, well, why don't you tell me something that has changed, that some way that you have grown over the past 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? What have you accomplished that you're really proud of? What do you like about yourself more now than you did back then? In what ways are you more comfortable in your own skin? And of course, everybody has something that they can add to that. I'll say, well, that's also a part of your aging. So contextualizing it as this multi-directional process is important to understanding ageism. So I want to challenge you by having you think about these questions. What do you think it means to be old and young? How do you feel about your own aging? And how do you talk about growing older? So I just want you to take a moment and just think about this and reflect on this for a second. Where are you right now and right this moment, right? How do you think about oldness? How do you think about youth? Do you connect with your own aging and talk about your own aging as something that is growing, developing, or is it more passively just you're getting older? All of these things are really important to kind of understand where you are today and even where you are just right this moment, and gives you a place then to reflect as you learn more and you think more. So as Tatiana was sharing before, setting a beautiful stage that how we age and how we experience any kind of ism or discrimination is really kind of intersectional. It really matters about all of the different forms of identity that we bring to the world. So we all have many different forms of identity. We have our class, we have our culture, we have our race, we have our gender identity, our sexual orientation, our level of ability, and all of these things come together to shape us, to shape our experiences, to shape how the world responds to us. Age is an interesting form of identity because age is one of the few, not the only, but one of the few that continually changes over time. So how we interact with the world when we're 20 is very different than when we're 80, for example. The world responds to us differently and we respond to the world differently. So our age identity is constantly forming and reforming over time, which makes ageism very interesting because ageism is often layered onto some of these other forms of identity, other ways that we can be marginalized. So it's important to reflect on the whole picture of what makes you you, because how you age, the opportunities you are afforded, and the barriers that you face are really dependent upon all of the forms of your identity. One of the things that I find really interesting when we're talking about aging and when we're talking about development is that we have a real framework and understanding for what development means over time, starting from infancy and toddlerhood into childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. And then we have yet to really embrace a term or understanding for what late life development means. We still talk about it as adulthood, late life adulthood. So I think that there's a lot of power and purpose in recognizing that late life adulthood, which I call elderhood, is a purposeful, distinctive stage of development and stage of life that looks different from adulthood. I think elderhood has power and potential because it is a growth-oriented term that means that we are still continuing to become. And those ways that we continue to become are different than adulthood. Part of ageism is the fact that we don't have a ready alternative or word or term to describe growth in later life. Yes, we are still adults as we are older, but what if our opportunities were different? What if the ways that we grew into ourselves were different? What if there was value associated with that? Instead of thinking of later life as retirement or withdrawal or based on who I used to be. To me, elderhood is a strengths-based term about who I continue to become. So the fact that we don't have kind of this ready word or concept or understanding of growth and development in later life, I think is another one of those factors that leads us right into ageism and makes it not surprising that we live in a very ageist society. So if aging is much more than we understand and realize, and if we're really kind of stuck in a pattern of us versus them, of misusing the term aging to talk about other people in a process of decline, a lack of understanding of growth and development in later life, then ageism is also very deeply, deeply rooted and much more than we realize. Ageism is actually really complex. A lot of people, when I first ask them what they think ageism is, will say, well, that's kind of what happened when older people at work can't get a job or don't get promoted. And that is absolutely a part of ageism, but it really just scratches the surface. Ageism is other directed. It is certainly about other people. So that can be discrimination, marginalization, oppression towards people that we see as either older than or younger than ourselves. It does go in both directions. So anytime we make an assumption, a judgment, or we stereotype someone because we perceive them as older or younger, we're kind of participating in other directed ageism. So ageism towards others. But ageism is also internally directed or self-directed. And that goes back to those questions that I asked you a few minutes ago. How we feel about our own aging, how we identify with our own aging, how we identify with being old. Just even using that term old, a lot of people will bristle at being called old. That's all internalized ageism. And that has very powerful consequences, which I'll talk about in just a second. So ageism is other directed, ageism is inner directed, and ageism is also relational, meaning that it lives in the space of our relationships. Have you ever received a compliment, a so-called compliment that you look great for your age, or you haven't aged a bit, or you are ageless, or any one of these things? These compliments live in this kind of relational space where we give each other the value association with looking, acting, or feeling younger, which we take as a compliment, and then we internalize as, wow, okay, success means that I need to look, act, or feel younger. And then that perpetuates ageism. And all of that comes from cultural messages that we get that aging is something we want to fear, that aging is something we want to avoid. So it lives out in this relational space, and it's something that we give back and forth to each other in daily conversation and our everyday language. So again, it's a complex phenomenon, other-directed, inner-directed, and it's relational. So why does it matter? And if you can take one thing away from today, this is what I hope you take away from it, is that it matters for a lot of different reasons. But we have a wealth of knowledge that shows that ageism is bad for our health. Becca Levy's work from Yale has showed us for decades that we are at increased risk of all kinds of negative outcomes just based on how we perceive ourselves and our own aging, including decreased longevity. I'm sure many of you have heard this before. If not, I think it's a very powerful statistic. One of her studies from 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago at this point, showed that people who had positive views of their own aging lived an average of 7.5 years longer than people with negative views. And in fact, she'd also just came out with research this week that showed that self-perceptions of aging were related to mild cognitive impairment and reversing the effects of mild cognitive impairment. There's a lot of power in how we see our own aging, and whether we cause ourselves a lot of stress, thinking about, well, I'm just going to get depressed and I'm not going to contribute and there's not going to be a place for me, to feeling like I am still becoming. There's power and purpose in my life. So there's a lot wrapped up in it when it comes to our own health and the consequences associated with that. There's also social consequences that I think are really important. And ageism risks really do live within the tech and the business space. And I think this is important to think about because I think there's a lot of missed opportunities that's here. So when we develop products and services for older people, there's a couple of ways in which I don't think we're particularly person-centered. Number one, we don't really often ask older people or include them in the research and development when we are designing and developing these products. So we go with products and services that we think older people want, which tend to focus on safety and security and surveillance. And those are helpful, but we miss out on opportunities for people's sense of belonging, self-actualization, the things that actually may enrich some people's lives. So we design and we develop without input from people. We may miss opportunities there, as I said. The other thing that we miss out on is we often design and develop for older people without giving support or instructions for how to use new technology to older people. And on the slide, I have this example of this QR code because this happened to me, and that's happened to my dad when we were out for dinner right at the end of the pandemic when restaurants started to open again, and they didn't have the menus anymore. They had the QR code on the table. So he, just kind of knew what it was, but didn't exactly know how to use it. And so he kept taking pictures of it instead of scanning it. And he was getting frustrated. And then I showed him how to use it and he got it. But it got me thinking that we design and develop things, but we don't often guide people or give the instructions for how to use it, which doesn't, really work. That's also kind of contributing to ageism because we're not creating the supportive environment. So there's a lot of room here for growth. Also, ageism is really at the center in our workplaces, and we're hearing a lot more about workplace ageism, but I think this is particularly important for those of us that work in the field, that work with adults or on behalf of older adults, or educating about gerontology. My own research has showed that, first of all, we hire a lot of people to work with older adults that don't necessarily like being around older adults. That's problem number one. But number two, we don't technically ask questions usually about how people feel about their own aging before they start working with older adults. And my research found that people who had negative attitudes, anxiety about aging, and internalized ageism were not as happy at work, and they were not as likely to stay. So it affects our consumer interactions, it affects our relationships at work, and then that also leads to quality of care that is delivered. And what's beautiful is that there's many free things that we could do just to onboard people and get them thinking about ageism and get them thinking about their attitudes about aging and how that could impact their job. In the culture that we have now, where we're really looking at recruitment and retention challenges, I think that there could be a lot of power here. So ageism is everywhere. This is just some examples of what it can look like. The fact that we have an anti-aging industry, the fact that we say past their prime, or I'm 69 years young instead of old, or boomers are out of touch. All of these things contribute to how we think about aging and how we think about ageism. And it really does live within the cultural space. I always like to take a moment to point out that I see generational ageism as a form of ageism. When we make assumptions or judgments against people or towards people based on their perceived generation, we are essentially making an assumption or a judgment based on their age. And I think it's important for us to think about the generational rhetoric and to think about, when we use these generational labels, how we're not actually seeing the unique individual in front of us. If you go back to that slide of who are you and all of the different forms of the identity that we bring with us, we realize that you can't possibly predict something about somebody's likes or dislikes or behaviors based on one characteristic, certainly not based on the year they were born or the 20-year span in which they were born. So the next time we talk about boomers as being a certain way, millennials being a certain way, I'd like to challenge us to think about that a little bit differently and to think about that as slipping into a form of ageism. The other thing that's very interesting to me, and that I'm learning more about myself, is this slippery slope between ageism and ableism. While ageism is discrimination based on age, ableism is discrimination based on ability. And there's a tremendous amount of overlap in between. And in fact, I think a lot of what we think of ageism is actually rooted in ableism. So for example, if you think about the successful aging narrative, right? We talk about successful aging in a few different ways. We talk about people that are successful if they have maintained cognitive ability, maintained physical ability, maintained engagement with life. But as I said before, aging is the biopsychosocial spiritual change. It's a process of change over time, including decline. And we can decline and experience cognitive changes and physical changes and still be successful. We can actually make our own definition of success. So when we move from being nervous about age and feeling devalued based on age to feeling devalued based on ability and not being able to claim success, that moves us from ageism into ableism. So what do? Well, first we pause and we take a moment to think. We evaluate and think about the words we use, the way that we think, and then we realize that we do have the power to act. We have the power to change the narrative. We've done it with things before. We can do it with ageism. So when you pause, here are some things to remember. Remember that people are individuals. Think back to that generational rhetoric and the generational stereotype. We can't predict things based on one characteristic from one person. And in fact, people get more individual as they get older. So remember the individuality of each person that we're talking to and referring to. Remember that age alone doesn't predict ability, and ability does not predict success, right? So we can start to really think about this relationship between ageism and ableism. One of the things we can all remember is that we are all aging. Aging is about all of us. It is the one universal connection that we all share. And it's something that we all share throughout our entire lives. We can remember that generations are not homogeneous groups. They are made up of individual people with individual likes and dislikes. And finally, we can think about elderhood as a stage of life, a stage based on growth, based on development, and based on opportunity. So I hope that you all can think about creating your own definition of successful aging. What does successful aging mean to you? What is it that you hope your older adulthood, your elderhood to look like? And remember that that definition of success can continue to evolve and change over time. What you think it may be now might not be what it will be in 10 years. So success can be fluid and individually driven. So I've only talked to you for about 25 minutes now, and maybe, just maybe, you think about these 3 questions a little bit differently. So reflect on it one more time. What do you think it means to be old and young? How do you feel about your own aging? And how do you talk about growing older? And maybe you can recognize that within this short period of time, you have some things that you can think about that can help enrich you in this area, that can help you grow in this area. So continue to refer back to these questions and to check in with yourself. So I thank you so much for the time today to share. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tracy. And thank you for putting up the photo of your book as well. I want to make sure we'll share resources at the end of the presentation, and we'll be sure to share the link as well. We want a little bit of engagement from you, and I've been watching the chat, and I see there's quite a lot of conversation happening there, which is great. And we actually have a poll question for you here that we'll put up in a second and see what you think the answer is. So there is the quiz. According to the National Poll on Healthy Aging, what percentage do you think of older adults have experienced everyday ageism? Tracy will walk us through the answer for this one. Thanks, Tracy.
You're welcome. All right. Are we going to pull the results up? What do you think? What percentage of older adults do you think have experienced everyday ageism? I am curious to see what you all think. Very good. You are absolutely right. It is 93.4%. That's the number that experience everyday ageism. That's a lot of us. A lot of us, yeah.
This is a staggering number. I have
really
to say,
is.
if I had to guess, I would have maybe hoped it's, a little bit less, but most folks, 60%, got it right. And I think, Tracy, that really speaks to the value of your work and the need for action. So thank you so much again for your presentation. And everyone, if you have questions for Dr. Gandron, please do put them in chat. We will have a Q&A for the last 30 minutes of our time together. So put those questions up in chat now, and Dr. Gandron will address them later. And what I will do now, I will transition to introducing members of our panel who will reflect on Dr. Gandron's presentation and also share a little bit of what their respective organizations are doing to address ageism. I'm of the mindset that we can just talk about the problem, but it's important to name that the problem exists, but really start looking for solutions and action. And so what I'll do, I'll introduce the panelists one by one and kind of have them answer the question as I introduce you so that you could remember better who they are. And I will start with Trish D'Antonio, who is the Vice President of Policy and Professional Affairs for the Gerontological Society of America, and is also a board-certified geriatric pharmacist. Trish directs GSA's policy initiatives and is responsible for developing relationships with organizations in the aging arena. She serves as the executive director for the National Center to Reframe Aging, which is the central hub to advance the long-term social change to improve the public's understanding of what aging actually means and the many ways that older people contribute to our society. Trish, thank you so much for being with us here today. And could you kind of get us started by sharing the ways in which GSA is working to reframe aging and challenge ages?
Sure. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here today. I'm really excited to be able to share some of the work and represent the work of the National Center to Reframe Aging, which is led by the Gerontological Society on behalf of 10 leading aging organizations. So those organizations include AARP, the American Federation for Aging Research, American Society on Aging, the American Geriatric Society, the National Hispanic Council on Aging, the National Council on Aging, US Aging, Grantmakers in Aging, and Leading Age. And so I list all of those organizations very specifically so that participants recognize that this is an effort by organizations, some that you may be familiar with, some that might be new to you, but recognizing that we're all working together to advance a better way that we can communicate about aging so that we can advance that understanding of aging. So the National Center is dedicated to reshaping the conversation and ending ageism by advancing an equitable and complete story about aging. We cultivate an active community of individuals and organizations around the country to spread awareness of implicit bias against older people. I think one of the things that we all recognized as we heard Tracy speak is that we all carry that implicit bias about aging, and we don't realize that until either someone points that out to us or we really start to reflect ourselves because we're participating in webinars like this today, right? Ultimately, our goal is, as we spread this awareness about implicit bias, as we get people, as we start to change our communication strategies, we ultimately want to influence policies and practice that benefit us all as we age. So our work is evidence-based. We've worked with a research partner, the Frameworks Institute, to conduct that research, find out what do aging experts think, and also learn what the public thinks about aging. And this includes training and resources that have been developed from this to think about those traps we should avoid when we're communicating about aging in our communication strategies, and also think about how we can better frame our messages to drive a more productive thinking, recognizing aging as that heterogeneity that we all know about, that Tracy was just talking about, as far as, you know, if we all thought about somebody who is 72 years old right now, I guarantee you we'd all think about somebody differently, right? So a few concrete pieces that I want to share with you that we have developed, and I know that the center is planning on sharing links to these resources for you in a follow-up message. So please don't worry if you don't get everything down right now on the call. You know, as we work nationally and as we work with organizations locally and regionally, we have a newsletter that shares how you can see how different communities have improve their communication strategies, right? Whether that's when you're speaking, your website for your organization, when you're writing something that you might be publishing. We work with people to help learn more directly about what these communication strategies are. We have some videos that are less than 2 minutes each. That is a series that outlines some of the traps that we should avoid, that talk about fatalism, that pits generations against one another, things that we learned in our research that really can be unproductive as we're trying to get people to think about aging in a much more robust way. We also have a quick start guide that I would encourage you all to take a look at, because you'll hear us all speak today and you'll say, what can I do next? And nothing like something that says, try this instead of that, when you're trying to think about what you can do next. And then because we're speaking before the University of Minnesota's Center on Healthy and Innovative Aging, I thought it was important for us to share one piece that I think is so important, is that through the National Center, we have been able to get leading manuals of style that are used across the country, actually around the world, to update their inclusive language, their age inclusive language. So the American Medical Association, the American Psychological Association, and the Associated Press are 3 manuals of style that have been updated for how we reference older people, how we talk about aging in our publications. So think about that. You know, so often we might inadvertently drive that implicit bias about aging as we continue to write in our research, write in our publications in terms of decline and disability and death when we talk about aging. So we really want to drive some important patterns of thinking that the public has that we need to activate. And I can, if we still have time, I think I still have enough time, I can go through those. And then I would encourage you to take a look at our website, take a look at our resources and some of the webinars that we have that help take you through these step by step. I think one thing that we know that we want to advance are patterns of thinking or patterns of communication that are not really dominant for us and that we learned in our research that we don't really think of. One is that what surrounds us shapes us, right? So where we live, who we know, the resources we have access to, and the systems we interact with all impact our lives. And we hear this sometimes talked about as social determinants of health, but the broader view takes into account even our genetics, environmental conditions, and inequities in our systems, inequity in our health system, for example. You know, individualistic thinking makes it difficult for us to recognize these social supports and systemic factors that can help improve outcomes for all of us as we age. So recognizing that what surrounds us shapes us helps us counteract challenges of individualism and us versus them thinking, that pitting generations against one another. Another strategy that we try to advance is that we see ourselves as members of a community, members of society. We are all interconnected, right? So therefore, we all recognize our collective responsibility to contribute to improved conditions in small or large ways that as we think about aging, right? Our innate sense of collective responsibility can often motivate us to think about, you know, design of programs, how we adopt programs that support us all as we age, and can help us change policies and systems to support aging. And then in another way, a final strategy that we try to advance is that big problems can be solved. And when people start to think, you know, when there's a lack of recognition of contributions of older people and the supports we need, right, we recognize that we can solve these problems. So we want to drive in our communications very quickly. I've brought this all to you, but what we want to drive is that those more productive patterns of thinking that are not quite dominant for all of us. But it's our job to activate these patterns and steer people away from those dominant patterns of thinking, those traps that we want to avoid, in order to improve how the public thinks about aging, how we all think about policy and practices to support us as we age. So with that, I'll go back on mute, and thanks.
No, don't leave. We will engage. Everybody gets one question, then we all talk together. But Trish, thank you so much for sharing this. You know, I've heard and I've reviewed the materials from the National Center to Reframe Aging, and I think this is one of those that we must continue to do it because I see, you know, even though the resources have been widely shared, as a, you know, reviewer for many journals, as a member of editorial board, serving on a study section, I see these ageist terms that supposedly have been updated used time and time again. This is just one example. Yeah. So this shows persistence, perseverance, and we need all of us doing this work together. And for everybody, we will share all of these resources at the end of the webinar today. I see questions coming in Q&A as well. Please feel free to add more questions. But for now, let me introduce our second panelist. And Kathy, I'll just introduce you second for now. So Kathy McClear is the AARP Minnesota State Director, who leads the North Star State's work as a wise friend and a fierce defender, I love this, of the 50 plus, and on behalf of Minnesota's over 600,000 AARP members. She does it through advocacy, community engagement, and volunteer engagement. Kathy has been with AARP since 2005, serving first as the Associate State Director for Communications in South Dakota State Office, then a Senior Advisor for the Central Region. And I love this, Kathy, that you came to AARP from doing work in broadcast news in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and then Minneapolis, Minnesota markets. Could you tell us a little bit, just sort of as a snippet, and then we'll all engage in a conversation, what are key ways in which Minnesota AARP is working to reframe aging and challenge ageism?
Yeah, well, thank you for the invitation to be here and to speak with you all today and be part of this really important conversation. So, AARP is the nation's largest nonprofit, nonpartisan social mission organization. We have nearly 38 million members nationwide, and including 620,000 right here in Minnesota. And AARP has long been focused on challenging some of those outdated beliefs about aging and really looking for solutions that can empower people to choose how they live as they age. And while we've done that for more than 60 years, recently our CEO, Joanne Jenkins, wrote a book called Disrupt Aging, and really renewed that effort to change the conversation and ultimately change the view on aging. AARP invests in research and conducts research. We challenge stereotypes in the media. We fight for policy change to ensure the health and financial security of those 50 and older. And we work to make communities stronger and more livable so that citizens of all age can thrive. And we provide opportunities for the 50 plus to experience personal fulfillment and purpose. And so I want to highlight just a few of those very briefly before we move on. So our research that we focus on really works to improve health outcomes and inform the ways that we can help people live longer, more fulfilling lives. Some of our research has found that people who have meaning and purpose in their life live 7 to 8 years longer than people who don't. Individuals with positive view on aging are 44% more likely to recover from a severe disability. And individuals with a positive outlook on aging also have an 80% reduction in cardiovascular risk. So that's pretty incredible. While we're living longer than ever before, we also know that the images that we see reflected back on us don't reflect the true image of aging and what that looks like. 81% of boomers said that they do not feel represented in media imagery. And 83% of millennials said they wish that ads had more realistic images of people. And we know that women often hold the purse strings. 70% of women say that they are more likely to buy from brands whose ads feature a mix of ages. So in 2019, in collaboration with Getty Images, AARP launched the Disrupt Aging Collection, which is a library of nearly 14,000 images designed to paint that more realistic, more accurate portrait of people, of how people age in society today. And those images really reflect older adults who are working longer, who are starting families later, people who are raising children or raising grandchildren, acting as caregivers for multiple generations, showing folks who are living vibrant lives full of travel, entertainment, dating, technology, and they buy beauty products who want clothes that make them look and feel good. They live lives that they're surrounded by people of all ages every day. And so that's been a really interesting initiative that we launched. We know that we're living and working longer. So for the first time in history, workforces span 5 generations. Technology has really transformed how we work, and certainly COVID-19 accelerated those trends and is really redefining what a multi-generational and ageless office looks like. So in that realm, AARP advocates and supports policies that strengthen age discrimination laws. We work with employers to adopt tools and policies to ensure inclusiveness for every team member, regardless of their age. And we offer workshops and resources for older workers to stay competitive in the workforce and kind of reimagine their work for either a second act or an encore career. And finally, I want to talk just a bit more about our age-friendly work right here in Minnesota. So as we work to address our changing demographics and ensure that individuals not only age in place, but really thrive as they age, according to the Census Bureau, by the year 2034, there will be more people 65 and older in the United States than those younger than 18. In Minnesota, we crossed that line in 2020. We already have more residents over the age of 65 than we do school-age children. So the AARP network of age-friendly states and communities was established in 2012. It's an independent affiliate of the World Health Organization's global network for age-friendly cities and communities. And what this network does is it provides communities with resources to become more age-friendly and more livable by tapping into some of that national and global research, helping them create some planning models and sharing of best practices. And I'm really proud to share that in 2019, Minnesota became the 10th state in the nation to enroll in that network as a state. And we now have 18 communities and counting that have joined the network. So what we like to say is what's good for someone who's 80 is good for someone who is 8. And people of all ages really benefit from that adoption of policies and programs that make our neighborhoods more walkable, that feature transportation options. We enable access to key services, provide opportunities to really participate in those community activities, and support housing that's affordable and adaptable for individuals as they go through that continuum of their life. We engage with elected officials, partner organizations, and local leaders to really help guide those communities through that age-friendly process, which includes a needs assessment, and creating an action plan, implementation of the plan, and then the evaluation processes. And I think, Dr. Gendron referred to this earlier too, but the most important piece really about the age-friendly network, ensuring that older individuals aren't simply the beneficiary of these efforts, but really that older individuals are included in and involved through every step of the process. And then, of course, we do our local advocacy working to support family caregivers. We have lots of activities and opportunities for people to get involved, engage with their community, and offer them ways to give back through volunteerism and service. So that's just the few things we're working on.
Just a few. Thank you so much for sharing that, Kathy. And I value so much what Minnesota AARP is doing and really appreciate your comments. And I want to call out a question from Andrea in chat, which I want to reflect on. And what Andrea said is that what is too often missing from these very valuable conversations is the testimony of older people themselves, and suggest the example of look into the arts. Andrea, you are correct. And that is something that we will do better in, as Kathy, you highlighted, doing work for older people without older people. We were certainly mindful of it, and we'll actually hold a conversation with members of our advisory board who do represent older adults, but we should be doing better. So criticism well taken, and thank you for sharing that comment. And you see, we have a number of experts here whose resources we can use to guide ourselves as we do better. Let me introduce my colleague, Dr. Rajan Moon, as our third panelist. Dr. Rajan Moon is the Associate Director for Education with the Center for Healthy Aging and Innovation here at the School of Public Health at the University of Minnesota. It's a tongue twister for me. His work focuses on supporting students and future leaders, as well as age-friendly university initiatives, which hopefully he'll tell us more about, which support lifelong learners who can engage in and enrich our campus life, which I have seen in those who have taken my own classes. We're so excited and thrilled to have our older adult learners take our courses. Rajan also serves as an AARP Disrupt Aging classroom facilitator. And in 2022, Rajan was named one of the Next Avenue's 10 influencers in aging. So Rajan, please tell us a little bit more about your work and how all these different initiatives you are involved in work to disrupt aging. Disrupt ageism. Reframe aging, yes.
Thank you so much for organizing this webinar. This is a very important topic and one that I'm very passionate about. This week, I actually had the pleasure of presenting a workshop on a topic that we do, moving from ageism to age-friendly, for a congregation in Southeast Minneapolis. And this community presentation is just one example of the important work that we do at the Center for Healthy Aging and Innovation as it relates to combating ageism. We've conducted now over 24 of these ageism to age-friendly workshops across the state. They include small groups, like 10 to large groups. 2 weeks ago, I did one for 450, and some partnerships with like the Minneapolis Institute of Art, where we trained all of their staff and their volunteers on what it means to age and really to combat ageism and make sure that the Institute is very age welcoming. As Tatiana mentioned, I also am one of the certified trainers for the Disrupt Aging Classroom Initiative done by AARP. This is an amazing opportunity. If you are in a higher ed institution, you can request a speaker. Many of them are retired lifelong learners to come into your classroom and talk about ageism and talk about the important impact that health professions and other disciplines have in creating age-friendly communities and age-friendly ecosystems. The University of Minnesota itself was the first higher education institution in the state to enroll in the global network of age-friendly universities. And we established an age-friendly council to oversee that work. And that council believes that we all benefit from intergenerational approaches and exchanges, that lifelong learners bring experience and perspective that enrich education and campus life, that diversity, equity, and inclusion are central pillars to all of the work that we do. And fundamentally, ageism is a pervasive form of bigotry that must be challenged and eliminated. So I know that there are a number of the Age-Friendly Council members today here in the audience, and I would love to have them include their comments in the chat as well related to our work. And then lastly, just to keep my comments brief so we can have a good conversation, we're also really interconnected to the broader system-wide initiatives to reframe aging within the state of Minnesota and beyond our state's boundaries as well, including serving on the Age-Friendly Minnesota Council, which is looking to shape that master blueprint for an age-friendly Minnesota, what's sometimes referred to as a plan on aging, a blueprint or a sector plan on aging. We choose to call ours the multi-sector blueprint for an age-friendly Minnesota. We also do work in advocacy related to ageism with our participation in the Minnesota Leadership Council on Aging. And then lastly, not to ignore the importance of ensuring that our health systems provide the highest services for older adults and their families to ensure that they have the highest quality of life and really focus on what matters to them and not just on health and sick care. We also, through the Minnesota North Star Geriatric Workforce Enhancement Program, are leading age-friendly health systems transformative work in federally qualified healthcare centers here in the metro area and are hoping to expand much of that work statewide. So that's just a little snippet of the work that we're doing in Minnesota at the University of Minnesota related to ageism.
Thank you so much for sharing, Rajan. And it is encouraging for me to see that despite the high prevalence of ageism, which we all need to address, there are a lot of initiatives happening. And thank you so much for all your work in that. I am very pleased to introduce our last but not least panelist. Mela Yang is a community outreach specialist at Trellis. In her role, Mela strives to build strong and trusting relationships with community partners. Mela is passionate about providing culturally appropriate resources and free educational presentations to uplift the aging population and those who care for them. Mela also serves on CHAI, the Center for Healthy Aging Innovation Community Advisory Board. So Mela, could you share a little bit, based on your role on the CAB and your role at Trellis, what are some ways that your organizations are working to combat ageism?
Thank you so much for having me here today. It is such an honor to share this space with everyone virtually. So at our agency at Trellis, we are one of the 6 area agency on aging throughout Minnesota, and we serve the 7-county metro area. Within our agency at Trellis, everyone on staff, yearly, we do an ageism training to talk about the topic and bring up the importance of all of the work that we do. Last year, after our training, we were, the team, we were accompanied by a book that is called Elderhood by Louise Aronson to help us further our education and knowledge on ageism. As well, Trellis is taking active role in reframing from using the word senior, because we know that that may not have it may have a negative connotation to it, and not everyone would like to be referred to as a senior. And so with that, instead, we are exchanging that to older adults or elders, our beloved elders, as it may be more preferable. And I know that in the Hmong community, as of respect, we do refer to our older adults as elders to show a sign of respect. Within our agency as well, our leadership team is very much involved in the age-friendly Minnesota work, as Regine had shared, and that is to help end the traditional view on ageism. And then in my department at Trellis, so I am with the volunteers and outreach team. With that work, we are always recruiting new volunteers where we are looking for older adults, especially those from the BIPOC or low-income community, and it is a bonus if they speak a second language. We do this intentionally to deepen our connections to the communities that we serve and to give voice to the older adults who have a different lived experience from our traditional staff and volunteers. As well, I can share that we have highlighted our volunteers by helping to elevate their images and voices and their diverse backgrounds in our literature to go out into the different communities that we go out to. The Hmong community, Spanish speaking community, Oromo, East African, West African, a lot of the different communities that we serve, we want to make sure it is culturally appropriate and the representation matter. And so that's why we use our volunteers as helpers to represent their community and what makes sense to them. And to show that we don't just serve the traditional community members, we serve all of those that live in the metro Twin Cities. So that's a little bit of what we do at our agency.
Thank you so much, Mayla. And again, we have this amazing combination of experts across such a broad continuum, and I'm just so excited to engage with all of you. I'm going to jump to a question actually that came through a Q&A, which maybe Tracy, you can get us started with it, and then just any of you, if you are interested in responding to this. And here's the question. Do you think that ageism is one of the more socially accepted, sort of in quotes, isms, because all people experience this identity compared to other identities that we don't all experience, like a race or sexual orientation or other identities? Tracy, could you get us started with that answer?
Yeah, sure. So I do think ageism can be a universal, because aging is something that is a universal, and it is something that tends to be a little bit more invisible and fly under the radar. But I also think that it's more productive for us to think about intersectionality and how all of the different forms of discrimination accumulate over time, rather than compare or contrast them, because I think they're all really important. And really figuring out how we layer them is particularly important. I will say with ageism that, you know, so much of what we talked about and all of the wonderful speakers have talked about is how it really flies under the radar. And it's so immersed within our cultural narrative and our cultural space that it is one that can be very hard to identify because it's just so normalized. So I think it needs particular attention to raise the awareness of it first, and then we can use these great tools that a lot of folks have shared to be able to change the way we think, change the way we speak, and change the way that we act.
Thank you, Tracy. Others, Trish.
You know, I completely agree with Tracy's comments here. And one of the things that informed our research was that ageism wasn't really, ageism wasn't really on anybody's radar screen. And so we do have research that supports that as we were trying to think about ways that, you know, why is it that we can't get practices and policies supported? And really it was that aging isn't thought of as, or ageism isn't thought of as seriously. So almost, I don't see, oh wait, the question moved over, but almost as Marty writes the question, that it's the ism isn't considered as serious. That being said, we have to recognize that we don't experience any of these isms by themselves either, right? So that we talk about that intersectionality now, and that level of awareness has become so much greater. We often hear, I mean, it's great work that's happening in Minnesota. We often hear from some of our colleagues around the country that as people attend DEI meetings, when someone raises the term age as part of that inclusion, people weren't ready to hear that, and people weren't ready to consider that as part of a program. So it's really important that we continue our message. I think we have we ourselves all work in aging and are experts in aging. So we talk amongst ourselves in a way that we understand this, but we have to remember to share that with other colleagues. And they might be colleagues in the university, believe it or not, right? And may be colleagues personally and professionally. And so that's what's really important, to explain that intersectionality.
Thank you, Trish. Rajan, Mayla, or Kathy, any other comments on that?
Sure. Well, I'll jump in. I think for too many Americans that, their life expectancy is really impacted by their gender, their ethnicity, their income, their education, sometimes their zip code even. And so AARP really works to build that more equitable society and advocating for programs that enable the people to live with dignity and purpose as they age. And so, really thinking about some of those policy recommendations to address those disparities so that we can all age as we want to. It's really about choice and, looking at it how you want to age, where you want to live, how you want to be cared for, and making sure that we have policies that support those things. And
And I appreciate that we are touching here on intersectionality, right, which Tracy defined the intersection of different identities, age, race, sex, gender identity. And so I know Rajan and Mela, if you want to kind of touch on that more intentionally on what are some things that we can do better or that maybe you already are doing in your different organizations and hats you wear that get at this intersectionality associated with ageism as well. Mela, you talked about it a bit already with language and such, but I don't know if you have anything else you want to add.
Yeah, I can definitely share. And so with my role as a community outreach specialist at Trellis, it gives me the opportunity to connect with individuals of different age, gender, ethnicity on a daily basis. And so I like to view my work and the community members that I serve as a whole person. So meaning regardless of their age, gender, disability, financial status, whatever that looks like, the older adult will receive the services and resources. So looking at the person as a whole person, and despite of everything else that may come, with them. And so, for example, this week alone, I was at 2 different sites in the community, and we hosted lunch and learn and talked about fraud and scams that were targeted towards older adults. And the end goal of this was to invite and encourage everyone to attend and to share the resources that are available and to just host a shared space for social connection, because we know that that can be something that may be isolating for a lot of older adults, especially since they are living in senior homes. And our goal and hope is that when we do host these events, that we can gather groups together to share and to talk, whether they agree or disagree, to just have that safe space for them. And as mentioned earlier, I am a member of the Community Advisory Board, also known as CAB, so here with the U of M. And so with that role, the Community Advisory Board helps to advance health equity for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, LGBTQ, and other underserved aging communities. And so that is a core work to CHI's mission. With that role, I wanted to highlight a program that other community members and myself have since been developing for several months now. It is a project that is a community-led toolkit to address and reframe age-related stigma and discrimination. This toolkit we looked at encompasses 3 different types of age-related stigma that were all common to all of the different cultural groups within the different members that were in the group. And we came up with 3 of the physical, cognitive, and social economic stigmas in those different groups. And that is with the East African, West African, African American, Native American, the Latino, and the Hmong community, that even though there were many differences, a lot of them were very similar. And so this toolkit will, the end goal, the end result is that once this is completed, we can then share with providers, with community members, even students, so that they can have a broader and better scope of understanding of older adults and the different ethnicity or groups that they may encounter in the future.
Thank you so much, Mela. And I am just so encouraged by the work of our CAB. And as you described, our CAB includes folks from different lived experiences, racial, ethnic groups, ages, importantly as well. And it is really telling that the first project that you all decided to focus on was this toolkit on addressing ageism. And it speaks to the prevalence of the experiences as we saw from our poll today, but also that we can take action, right? I used to in my role as an instructor in teaching students about all these different isms, I used to get a lot of comments from students that it's so depressing to hear about the prevalence of all these problems. And so, but then when we start coming up with solutions that we can be part of that solution, I think that's one way to make a difference. And it's clear that the CAB is doing it. And I hope that for others in chat, if you have questions for Mayla, feel free to put those in chat or in the Q&A, and we can address those as they come in. Rajan, did you have anything else to add on the sort of intersectionality of ageism with other forms of discrimination?
Yeah, thank you, Tatiana. And I think Mayla put it very, very well, talking about our equity and community engagement core, which is led by Robin Fraser. And I know Robin is here, so if people have questions as well about that, she's able to do some answering of that. You know, equity is really a key component of all the work that we do at CHI, not just a separate equity and community engagement core, but interwoven into our education, our research, and our clinical practice domains. You know, for example, the work that we do on intersectionality in our presentations from ageism to age-friendly is critical. We, you know, trace the history of ageism and talk about a lot of the work occurring from the Frameworks Institute and Disrupt Aging, but we also talk about some of the fundamental work around intersectionality that was laid forth by like a legal scholar like Kimberly Crenshaw, who really sort of described the word intersectionality as being something more than the sum of our parts, and how just phenomenally that fits in. And is specifically also as a land grant in a research university, it's important for us to understand the dynamic identities that people have in our research. For example, if we're doing research like you do, Tatiana, a well-known national researcher on long-term care quality and workforce, it's impossible for us to ignore things like race and gender while we're also exploring things like age. So I do think, back to the question from Dr. DeLima when she was talking about sort of the socially acceptedness of ageism, you know, there is this idea of the insidiousness of ageism, and we have to be very purposeful in thinking about the intersectionality, not only from ageism, looking at things like race and gender identity, sexual orientation, et cetera, but also the reverse. We need to encourage that scholars that are doing research in race or gender studies to also embrace the concept of intersectionality from an aging perspective. That, you know, we are all aging, women are aging, people of color are aging, sexual and gender minorities are aging. And the one last point I would say is a project that Dr. Shippey and I are working together on, looking at the experience of LGBTQ older adults in senior care settings, in nursing homes and assisted living. So certainly the intersection between aging, sexual orientation, and gender identity, where in the LGBTQ community, rather interesting study was done just over a decade ago, asking LGBT younger people, what do you consider old age to be? And the average age was 49. So looking at how aging occurs within other cultural groups really provides us with interesting insight into just the broader aging experience from an intersectionality perspective. So hopefully that wasn't too academic, and but some of the work that we're doing in research and practice at the U.
Thank you so much for sharing, Rajan. And this is all getting recorded, so hopefully it'll be a useful resource for an extended period of time. I think it's a good connection to a question that came in from Ming Chin Ling. And the question is, are there studies or polls looking specifically into ageism experienced by younger people? Tracy, do you want to take that first?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. Not as many as there are towards older people, that's for sure. But I think the ones that do exist are really interesting. There was one specifically that came out in 2021, and they called it youngism. And it's also been called adultism. I'm not particularly a fan of either of those terms because I think it's all ageism. So I think we really just need to name it as ageism rather than creating other terms. But this one study did show that it is, you know, prevalent, and it is something that younger people are experiencing. But interestingly, at least in their study, it was really focused more on contemporaneous generations. So it really feeds into that generational bias that I was talking about. And I did my own research, and I did a study that found that millennials and Gen Zers are feeling extraordinarily discriminated against, more so than any other generations did in my study, and then therefore are also kind of more likely to discriminate against people based on generation. So there are health consequences associated with it. That's more of Bakalibi's work as well, is that we're more likely to experience, I think, a cardiovascular event within like 40 years if we have negative attitudes about aging. But I think there's a lot more that needs to be explored here and understood in terms of the short and long-term consequences of ageism toward younger people.
Thank you for sharing, Tracy. Do others have any other comments or things you want to share? Ageism toward younger people. I'll jump in to share that my own research that looked at ageism at the workplace, in particular among women, in fact identified a U-shaped curve for age discrimination at work, where women under the age of 30 were being discriminated as, you know, not having enough credibility or whatnot for certain positions. And then age discrimination sort of leveled off and then started picking back up after age 55, increasing sort of exponentially after that. And my work also did show that age discrimination at work resulted in lost earnings, so financial hardship, as well as, you know, depressive mood and lower life satisfaction, because people were not being promoted as they should and were losing their jobs because of age discrimination at work. So definitely, again, something that needs more attention. I want to be mindful, there's a question of the questions we're getting and the time we have together. And if you have questions for each other as panelists, please feel free to jump in. I see a question from Jane came in, and I want to make sure we ask it. And Jane asks, how can we get caregiver information out that is done by caregivers and not those who think they know what we need? And I'm assuming it's in the context of ageism. So if anybody wants to take that question first.
I think engaging caregivers is probably the first thing that we need to do, is actually ask them what they need, which I think is part of the process of age-friendly health systems, age-friendly communities, is understanding what the community needs. I think Minnesota certainly attempts to engage people in conversations related to our comprehensive plans. One of the issues when we're talking about language, which is certainly an important part, and I think Dr. Gendron talked about this, and as did the National Center to Reframe Aging talks a lot about this as well, that, you know, even the very words that we use evoke images, and the challenge that often with that word.
We lost you for a second. But
sorry about that. Sorry. The people don't identify with even the word caregiver, right? They say that they are helping mom or they are helping their neighbor. And there's almost this, this need for us to have people adopt that they are a caregiver. So we're not even speaking their language. And there was an amazing initiative here that happened in Minnesota, led many years ago by the Wilder Foundation, that even just said, you picked up grandma's prescriptions yesterday, you're a caregiver. You're mowing your aunt's lawn, you're a caregiver. And there are services and supports to help you be that great caregiver. And so it does go back to language and how we identify. So I really appreciate the comment and the question, Jane, because engaging people in the services is extremely important, but also sometimes very difficult if people don't identify as being that. So language, yeah.
Yeah, Rajan, thank you for that. And, I'll also share that, as we're working on some of our advocacy around paid family leave in this legislative session here in Minnesota, there's a lot of conversation around, bonding with a new child, or when you adopt a child, which are very important things, right, for individuals who are in the workforce. But I think sometimes the older caregivers, folks who are caring for an aging loved one, often get left out of that conversation when you're talking about benefits that support caregivers. We know that in Minnesota, there are over 550,000 unpaid family caregivers who are providing care for a loved one, a family member, an aging parent, a spouse, a friend, a neighbor, and the economic value of that care is just tremendous, over $10 billion. And so, making sure that, yes, I mean, to Rajan's point, yes, lots of people are caregivers, and, some people identify that way and sometimes they don't. But also when you're having those conversations, a lot of the focus goes towards those younger individuals when you're talking about young family caregiving, and really needing to highlight that it's not just caring for a child, it's also caring for mom or dad or your spouse or yourself, and making sure that that's part of that conversation as well. And to the question that was in the chat about information, from caregivers, again, it's having that workshop, having that opportunity to connect with other caregivers, creating a community so that you can share those experiences. One of the things that we've started working with is a group of solo agers. So people who don't have, maybe blood family, or their children have moved far away, or they're widowed. How are they going to plan for their care as they continue to age with their chosen family? And how are you going to make sure that your needs are met when you might be the only one around? And so really looking at that broad spectrum of caregiving as we head into that, facing those needs as we age.
Yeah, go ahead,
Do you
Trish.
have time to add to that, or?
We can add to that, yeah.
So a couple of things that come to mind when I read the question, and as we're all speaking, I think one thing, part of why our movement began was because policies didn't necessarily recognize, as Kathy pointed out, what we need for all of us as we age, right? So that's really important to think about when we think about a caregiving policy in particular. And so I think it's a good point for policy that if we can get policy that benefits us all as we age and recognize that. But it's going to take time, and for the same reasons, right? We're trying for culture change here. We're not trying for something easy. If we were, it would have been done by now, right? And I think one of the things that I just wanted to highlight as part of culture change, we know that in national activities and federal activities, older people and people who care for older people are beginning to be part of not only a group that would be considered after a program starts, but as part of a program, as part of federal grants at the beginning. And one example that I think of is the Advisory Council for Alzheimer's and related dementias. There are not only people living with dementia who are part of the council, there are also people who care for people with dementia. And that's not to say that all caregivers are only for people with dementia. But that's a start there. That's where this can start to be recognized, the importance. And when we think about also the Raise Family Caregiver Council and the Raise Family Caregiver Act that passed, actively, people who are caregivers themselves are actively recruited to be part of these federal councils. And that really starts to drive how we all work and behave. And even as part of the Bold Public Health Center at the University of Minnesota, where I'm honored to serve as part of the executive committee for that Center of Excellence. There is an advisory group that are engaged community members, engaged caregivers, to help us understand what we need to do to help connect aging with public health when we talk about dementia. So those things are starting to happen. It might not always be as obvious because of where we are at the moment that we're in that, but continue to advocate for that and continue to ask those questions in every room that you're in, so that we can continue to advance those kinds of ideas.
Thank you, Trish. And I see a comment that came in from Shauna, and I just really agree with it, where Shauna is sharing that they've been waiting for the baby boomer generation to make aging cool, but we shouldn't be waiting for that to happen. We must be tackling it head on. And I'm hoping that that would be one of the outcomes from our session today. All of you are doing this work already, and that's why we're so honored to bring you together. But it takes the whole community. It's culture change, right? Go ahead, Tracy.
Thanks. I just wanted to add something very quickly, because I think I have a different take on this and a bit of a counter narrative.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, so I think that it's interesting to me that we use the term caregivers at all. So I think number one, there's either you're a caregiver now or you're going to be. And we talk about caregiving specifically when we're talking about older people. We talk about parenting when we talk about younger people. So if you go back kind of in history, you can see when there was kind of this split and we started to outsource caring for older people. But I think it all kind of comes back to the fact that it's a myth of independence. We are never, ever fully independent. We are always interdependent. And if you think about being interdependent your entire lives, you realize you are always a caregiver. You are always the care recipient. So I think if the language is really important, that we need to normalize this as well, that it is part of our human nature to give and receive care. And I think that's a fundamental element of a deeper dive and a deeper conversation.
Thank you for sharing that, Tracy. I see we have 10 minutes left, so I want to ask you this question, which could be kind of a big question, but if you can kind of tackle it with key messages. So if you look to the future and your work on addressing ageism comes to full fruition, all of you are doing this work daily, what will that future look like? Anyone wants to go first? Maybe Trish, was your work on reframing aging. What do you see that future looking like?
So I think, first of all, we recognize that future is just a future of interdependence that Tracy talks about, right? And recognizing that we all contribute, that we all work together and support one another, and also recognize, as we age, that we continue to have contribution to society, regardless of, when people think about frailty, and there's this automatic thought that because you might need assistive devices or you need long-term care services and supports, that those supports are so important for us to all have, because we all continue to contribute. We recognize our wisdom that we generate as we age. And usually what I say when I'm talking and somebody says, give me one phrase or one sentence, or what do you see in the future, is that I see a headline in the newspaper that the word ageism is removed from the dictionary because it has no meaning anymore. So that's really what I look for. That's the big piece that I look for. We don't have to use the word ageism anymore.
Oh, I love that. Tracy, what does that future look like to you?
I love that, Trish. I think that is just so great. And I think Trish said it really well. So I'll just build on that by saying I'm feeling really positive about the future. I mean, the fact that we have a panel here of people that are really invested in this, that we have a ton of organizations that are doing work in this area, that we are making this a word that has meaning at this point, means that we get closer to Trish's vision of not needing to understand what ageism is. So the takeaway message is that we're going to reach critical mass, and each person that receives this message and then does one little action, big or small, is getting us towards our goal.
I love that. Mela, what does that future look like to you?
That's a great question. And I agree with Trish and Dr. Gendron as well. I think that, as Dr. Gendron shared earlier during her presentation, we are all aging. And to me, one component of aging successfully would be to receive equitable and accessible services and resources for all. I think that's very, very important. We know that the resources and services are out there, but do our grandparents, do our parents know about it? Are they comfortable calling? And so to me, the future would look, what it would look like is resources that are culturally appropriate and appropriate with different languages, visuals for all caregivers, older adults, everyone. And a takeaway would be a message for those on the call here to share space, be somewhere where you're uncomfortable, to learn about the different culture, the ethnicity, whether you're a student and you have internships or volunteering roles or service learning, to put yourself into a community where you are interested and would like to learn more about, and to just be out there to learn about the different communities and older adults that are there. Thank you.
I love that, Mela. Kathy, what about you?
Sure. Well, AARP's vision really from the very get-go was a society in which everyone can age with dignity and purpose. And I think we can really get there in 3 ways. So health, wealth, and self. So focus on preventing disease with an emphasis on well-being throughout our entire lives. Wealth, saving for life, not just for the absence of financial hardship, but really for the means to thrive. And then self. So a more positive self-perception of aging that's associated with a longer life.
Thank you. That's powerful. And Rajan, conclude us on this question.
Yeah, well, it's hard to be the bookend. So because everything that's been said has been, quite inspirational for our future. For me, it's about communities that are, broadly defining that, whether it's a campus community or a city or a town or a faith community, that these communities are meaningfully intergenerational and interconnected, where both the challenges, and opportunities of aging are embraced and appreciated. That's kind of what I would like to see as a future, where I'm part of a community and I'm both a challenge and I'm an opportunity. So
I'm a visual person, so I'm imagining logos, banners with each of your key quotes. We need that for inspiration. Well, in 5 minutes we have left, I have one last ask for each of you. In a minute or less, would you please summarize what is one thing that the participants today could do that could impact ageism? And I'll start with Tracy.
Oh, just one thing. There are so many things. So I think for me, remember your why. Why does this matter to you? Because I think you carry that with you and then it takes you into a place of action. Does it matter because this is for your health and longevity? Does this matter because you're an entrepreneur and you really want to develop some business ideas? Does this matter because you work in the field and you really want to see people thrive and stay in their jobs and give good quality care? There are lots of reasons. Is it a social justice issue for you? Find your why and then use that why as a source of motivation.
Okay, so find your why and use it for motivation. Rajan, what's yours?
Sure, mine is really be aware of the insidiousness of ageism in the very language that we use. Words are evocative. They have deep meanings. They elicit emotions. They elicit images in our mind. And if we reframe our basic language that we use, we're simultaneously reframing the way we think, our attitudes and our beliefs about aging, about elderhood, about older adulthood. So eliminate those ageist words, embrace a more person-centered collective language that's age affirming.
Love it. Mela, what about you?
Thank you. I think Tracy and Rajan said it best. Self-awareness, understanding your own biases, stigma, learn from that, and then go out to the community and educate and raise awareness on the topic that we're talking about today.
Thank you, Mela. Kathy?
Well, I'm not very good at following rules, so I have 2. So in the 2 Ds, so dialogue, it starts with a conversation. So this conversations within your communities about really reframing those perceptions about aging, viewing age as an asset, not a liability, and just transforming the way we talk and tell the story about aging. And then drive change. So be an advocate, promote the policy changes that improve those health outcomes, improve financial resilience, and really ensures that we all have the opportunity to live and age well.
I love the 2 Ds. And Trish, please conclude us. What should we do? One big thing participants can do.
So one big thing, and I hope this kind of helps summarize too, is that remember that as we change our language, if we change our own perceptions, people will, and we use that language regularly, people will model that language. So it will help start to change the conversation. It will help start to change the thinking, and it will start to advance the policies and practices around aging that we seek. So real quickly, if you wanted to, you can start very quickly with the quick start guide that we provided in the chat. Just pick one thing next week when you're writing. And are you othering in your writing? Just take a look at it and start to make that change. And be the change you wish to seek in the world.
I love that. I think that's perfect for concluding this webinar. Be the change you want to see in the world. Thank you all so much for joining us today. A big, big thank you to all of our presenters for your time and for sharing your expertise with us. A thank you to the Life Course Center for co-sponsoring this webinar with us. And just look out for a list of resources we'll be sharing with you after the webinar. Stay in touch, and thank you for being committed to addressing ageism. Take care, everyone. Bye.